Thanks everyone for coming to this late afternoon seminar on One Health and facing the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. So my name's Aoife. I'm a plant pathologist at NIAB. We have a stand just behind there. Lots of different things to look at. And the reason we have this seminar today is NIAB have got into the area of One Health recently in the last couple of years through our work with Matt, who's going to present to you after I've kind of finished introducing the session. And it's an area that's very relevant to the Groundswell group here today, a lot of mixed farmers, and it's a topic that is of interest on a national scale, but also a global scale around changes in antimicrobial resistance through humans, through livestock, and through crops and plants as well. So I'm just going to chair the session today. I'm going to let my three wonderful speakers do their job. So we've got Matt here from Imperial College, Ed from Vet Sustain, and David Passmore, who's a mixed farmer in Oxfordshire. And I'm just going to hand the table over to them, and at the end we'll do a kind of 20-minute questions and answers. So please kind of prepare any questions. We'd like to take them all. We want to keep this as lively and interactive as possible, and please give your thoughts at the end of the session. So yeah, I'll just hand you over to Matt to introduce himself. And yeah, the floor is yours, Matt.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks so much, Aoife. That's brilliant. So I am Matt Fisher from the Imperial College. I work at the School of Public Health. I'm a mycologist. And I will be talking about antimicrobial resistance from the point of view of fungi and the fungal kingdom. And Ed will then kind of take over the more bacterial aspects. And then Dave will talk us through his lived experience of working with the various flavors of chemicals that are implicated in some of the One Health processes that we're seeing going on in the world. So where I come into this is from the human angle. And in the School of Public Health, we see all the flavors of humans that have some form of deficiency in their immune system, and they're susceptible to fungal infections. So they might have cystic fibrosis, they might have cancer, they might just be old. And then they become susceptible, and at that point, the clinician will diagnose a fungal infection and come in with an antifungal drug and hopefully cure them. So we have some 4 classes of clinical antifungals. That's not very many, and the reason that being is because fungi are basically just little animals. The fungal kingdom is sister to that of the animal kingdom, so their metabolisms are very similar to ours. So we've got very limited drug targets. We're utterly reliant on those 4 classes. Now, in the agricultural space, we've always been fighting fungi in our food systems. And back in the day, Romans didn't have very much to play with. Actually, they found that urine was a really good way of getting rid of molds. They'd just spread pee on their walls and stuff, and that would get rid of all the molds growing there. They'd also use it on their food items, and hey, that worked well, but they could do better. And so obviously we worked through time, 18th and 19th century, through arsenic, Bordeaux mixture, all these kind of pretty rough as guts fungicides. And then we're into the 20th century and the whole kind of explosion of the modern pharmacopoeia of fungicides that you can use in nature. And there's probably 25 to 30 registered classes of fungicides, so far more than we've got for the clinical antifungals, where we're limited to 4. Now, this is essentially the way that we chemically control the fungal kingdom. There's 3 million species of fungi that we share the planet with, both entirely beneficial, nay, absolutely essential. And obviously the Groundswells crowd are completely addicted to the soil health and that blizzard of fungal diversity, which locks carbon into the soil and powers the symbioses which grow our crops and our trees. So those are the good fungi. But then there's those bad fungi, the rust, smuts, blights, that can devastate our crops. And we have to spray hard when you've got monocultures at work. Now, fungi are intensely creative in the evolutionary space. So they evolve resistance to these control measures. And when you look into it, they've evolved resistance to every single class of chemical that we've thrown at them through time. They're absolutely brilliant at it. So our antifungals will work for a while. Eventually, they will break down. And fungi do this with a spectacular array of evolutionary mechanisms. They might, there's a whole load of stuff that they can do with their genomes, which I won't go into. But the major point is they will evolve resistance to our control. So what the kind of the on-farm consequence of this is that as your target evolves resistance, you will either have to use more drug or you'll have to shift to some other drug as they eventually break down because your target fungus has evolved resistance. So here we go, concentration of epoxyconazole used through time. And this Zymoseptoria is just becoming more and more resistant. And of course, that then really breaks down the ability to grow a good crop. So we're locked into an arms race from this perspective, having to use more through time. Now, this is where we're getting into the One Health space, because what the consequence of using those fungicides that are broad spectrum against all fungi in the environment, this is leading to off-target responses in pathogens that we don't care about as farmers, but we do care about as medics. And those are the molds, such as Aspergillus fumigatus, which are in the environment. They're evolving resistance, like everything else, to these fungicides. They're not affecting the crops, but they are affecting the humans. And so these are the exposures that are hitting our patients with cystic fibrosis, not clearing their infections. The clinicians come in with their antifungal drug, and it doesn't work. And the reason here is we use the same class of antifungal chemical. It is their azoles, very widely used in the environment, very widely used in the clinic. And the patients are acquiring resistant inocula that were generated in the environment. So we've measured this in the UK system. 1 in 20 of these Aspergillus spores that are now blowing in the wind, this is a 1 in 20 of those are now resistant to the azoles, and they're setting up resistant infections in patients that are not being cured by the use of antifungal drugs. This is an absolutely classic One Health problem, whereby ensuring our food security, we're developing a resistance which is embedding itself in our patients. So the question then being, what can we do about this? We have a system that is dependent on this chemical control in the environment, but is generating an inocula that's then exposed to our patients. And there are environmental hotspots where we know this is occurring. This is when post-harvest waste is allowed to get moldy, generating those spores, which then blow into the wind, and humans are exposed. So obviously, and that's where they end up in the hospital. So obviously this system isn't static. We're having new fungicides being developed. There are changing at-risk groups of people. So when COVID-19 came along and our respiratory health was affected, we got a lot of these azole-resistant mold infections appearing in patients with severe C19 infections. So, and climate's changing. That's going to alter the system, and our microbial diversity in pastures and soils is changing. So the question that we have to, as a group, address here is, what can we do about this exposure to fungi by fungicides? How can we use these in a way that is more rational, safer? It doesn't regenerate this bioaerosols inocula that causes this health problem for us. And yes, so that's something for you to kind of sit back and mull about as we move over into Ed's stump speech here on the bacteria.
So please use the last 20 minutes when we come back and we finish the talks to ask those big questions that Matt has posed there. We'd really like to hear them from the audience. Thanks.
Hi, just introducing myself. I'm Ed. I'm a farm vet in Wiltshire. And I also work with an organisation called Vet Sustain that's trying to link up some of these questions around One Health. Matt's already talked about how One Health is linking human health and animal health and how we farm. But of course, all of that is set into the wider context as well of planetary health. And Matt's set the scene on fungicide resistance and how we farm can be linked to some of the health problems that we're seeing in people. And I think possibly even better documented is what we've seen with antibiotics. So just to give some context of my experience with this, you've probably seen there's a good news story in farming on antibiotics, in that since 2015, then the use of antibiotics in livestock farming has halved, whilst the use of antibiotics in human medicine has actually lifted slightly, partly as a result of the COVID pandemic. So off our own backs, farmers generally prefer to do things of their own initiative rather than through regulation. Then there's been some really brilliant progress by the industry in terms of reducing the amount of antibiotics used, partly recognizing the fact that we'd gone from antibiotics being a wonder drug which can cure sick animals in the aftermath of the Second World War, to the stage maybe in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, where they were so widely used to the extent where they were being used as growth promoters around the world, and where the way we farm depended upon antibiotics as a crutch for animals to stay alive in the way that we were keeping them. So that has already shifted a lot. And this project with the Soil Association and with the Alliance to Save Our Antibiotics was looking to see how can we continue that downward trend. That the goal isn't necessarily zero. The goal is to use as little as possible, but as much as necessary. And so we were looking to see if we could identify trends amongst low users of antibiotics, to see where we could go next. And so we benchmarked a whole load of Soil Association farms on their antibiotic use. And like with any group of farms, there was a really, really big range of different users, some high-end, some using absolutely nothing at all. And then we did a range of interviews with those farmers at each point in that benchmarking scale to try and identify particular factors with what led to lower levels of usage. And really the combination of a standards framework, like we see with organic regulation, but also certain milk contracts, processor contracts, public pressure, supermarkets, all of those sorts of things, setting in place a framework by which people expect to use medicines is helpful. But the other half of that equation was the husbandry. And so how we approach welfare as being something which drives low antibiotic use rather than the opposite way round. So the key points really coming out of that report, as hopefully you can see, is that if we think of a farmed animal as effectively having a stress bucket in which they can put up with so much, but there's a capacity to that. If we make sure that the welfare of the animals under our care is as good as possible through correct breeding, correct feeding, having access to the outdoors as much as possible, the ability to express natural behavior, ability to socialize, to play, to do all of the things that we would like to do, then the immune system and the adrenal system are in really good nick, and that reduces the inflow to that bucket, whereas antibiotics really is a sticking plaster to try to deal with the sort of the outflow problem, so the viruses, the infections, the inflammation, and so on. So a way to approach reducing antibiotic use on your farm would be to establish what the main causes are for disease and mortality and work to reduce those as causes, rather than starting off by simply trying to reduce use. You have to work from cause rather than effect, and to look for farming solutions rather than relying on products, whether those be vaccines or alternative medicine or whatever. Products are never going to be the solution. It's how we farm is going to be the solution. And the reason for that is we can not only see an effect in ourselves and in animals, but we can have big effects at a soil level. Now, we're talking about antimicrobial resistance, and sometimes wormers and fly treatments and so on aren't really considered when we're thinking about antimicrobials, but we use them really, really widely. Even on farms that have zero antibiotic use, a lot of people would be using wormers, would be using fly treatments, and with good reason to try to help with welfare problems. But we understand more and more now the wider systemic effects that this is having on the soil food web. And we can see this slide from AHDB, how complex the soil food web is. And everybody here at Groundswell is switched on to that soil health message. You probably understand these relationships much better than I do. But what we do know is that the parasiticides that we're using in livestock farming are every bit as important as the antibiotics that we're using. And also that there is a cocktail effect. So that there is an additive situation where the more different chemical products that you use, the more difficult it is for that diverse soil food web to cope with that series of shocks. So if you're not using any antibiotics, you're more likely to be able to get away with using some antiparasitics and vice versa. Again, animal welfare is really important. We need to be able to use these things when necessary, but we're looking at farming in ways to reduce those necessary occasions as much as possible. And as I said in my introduction, then part of one way of looking at that is trying to make sure that we don't just focus on one thing at once. So all of the different aspects of living sustainably, farming sustainably, tend to be quite closely linked. And from a veterinary perspective, we've identified 6 Ws, where as vets working with animal owners, whether they be farmers or pet owners, or advising policymakers or whatever, there are 6 Ws where we can really make a difference. So that's wildlife, biodiversity. We know that the products that we use are having a big effect on the life around us. Water, we know that quite a lot of these products that we use are getting into wastewater potentially, and that if you ever read the back of a bottle of wormer, for example, it will often say how incredibly toxic it is to aquatic species, but then we don't make sure that we graze those animals well away from watercourses and so on after they've been wormed. Warming, we know that some of what we do in terms of keeping animals can have an effect on global warming. Welfare, so as vets and farmers, that's always high on agenda and is often missed off when we're talking about sustainability. The welfare of the animals under our care is super important, and we shouldn't neglect the welfare of those animals because we're chasing a soil health or a human health or a global warming goal. Waste, we know that waste in terms of the products that we use and so on have a footprint, don't they? When you look at the end of a vet visit, or after you've been doing something on the farm with a bunch of livestock, you can end up with a whole load of rubbish at the end of it. So again, trying to think about ways that we can reduce the number of products that we're using in our farming systems is important. And lastly, well-being. The well-being of you guys, of us, everyone who contributes to caring for animals in a farming system is a really important part of sustainability. So I just wanted to sort of zoom out a little bit from that close focus on antibiotics to reflect the fact that we need to have a slightly higher perspective to make sure that we don't make mistakes in one area by focusing too much on another. So you've probably had enough of me waffling on. Now we can talk to someone who's actually got real lived experience of doing this. I'll hand on to David.
Hello, my name's David Passmore. I'm a mixed farmer in the Chilterns near Wallingford, and hopefully practicing and curing a lot of problems we're seeing. And we are a traditional mixed farm, so the whole farm is ploughable, so essentially it could be an all-arable farm. But since the 1950s, we've always had about 40% of the farm in grass, a grass lay rotation with cattle and sheep. And if you go back to the 60s and 70s, it's how you had to farm because you didn't have all these modern wormers, less antibiotics, herbicides, fungicides, and things like that, plant growth regulators. Then by the 80s, 90s, 2000s, I sort of looked hopelessly out of date. And now, if you go around the farm, people go, wow, it all looks wonderful. You've got super crops. I haven't really changed anything. And it sort of brings back why Groundswell's here today and has developed as sort of the way forward is we've sort of lost that the natural processes in farming through going through a can. And like just looking at here today, I think they've moved now, but the cattle on that hill to me is brilliant. It'd be even better if you come back in 2 years' time and there's a super crop of wheat, and then a year after there's rape, and then wheat again, and then sheep, and then thing. And that rotation doesn't cure everything, but it takes so many pressures like worm burdens out of it. So we've never wormed a cow. We're rarely worming a sheep. It's not, we do sometimes in wet summers, but you're controlling, the sheep are controlling the weeds, the wheat crops are controlling the worms and the sheep, and the whole lot working together. And if your sheep haven't got worms, they're much healthier, they're growing quicker. If you do get a worm burden and you use a wormer, it works. So resistance just isn't an issue on the farm because, for example, I think I bought 2 cans of Atlantis in my farming career. So if I have to control blackgrass, I know it will work. So the farming system's avoiding all of that sort of use. So, for example, here we've got sheep. This is after 7 years of arable cropping. Then we go into a grass lay. So, stays in the grass lay. This field went into winter wheat last year. It's 20 hectares, 50 acres, had 1 blackgrass plant in it. It wasn't sprayed for blackgrass, and will regularly yield 14 tonne a hectare on chalk. Not too dissimilar to soil like this over chalk. And then you can counter it to, that's next door, just down the road, and that is a legume mix on a bad blackgrass situation, and it's still full of blackgrass. And you sort of, animals can control that. Now that is resistant blackgrass, but it's expensive to control. Those animals over there are doing it, and you can sell the beef. At the moment, I'd rather keep beef cattle than grow wheat, but all those things go up and down. You just take it as you go. So most of these microbial resistance, whether it's wormers, herbicides, you can get 95% of the control just through good, sensible farming. And what it does do, when you then use these products, it gives you confidence that they're going to work, because if you only use them once or twice, they will, they do work. So things like worm resistance aren't a problem. And if you use the wormer once and then a year later the field's in wheat, or if there is one resistant worm in the field, it's ploughed down, so it's sort of gone. And if you look at this field here, this was in wheat last year. Yes, 1 blackgrass plant. Well, in a rotation like that, if it's not resistant because it hasn't seen the herbicide, but these resistant problems just go get a chance. You're using the natural cycles of the animals, of crops to control them. We are doing some ploughing, things like that. But also you get in a mindset when you do need to use something, you've got confidence it's going to work. And if you look at these lambs, they haven't been wormed at all. They probably won't be wormed. But if you've got a worm burden in that, the first thing is the lamb's not very well. If you're a vet and you open up a lamb that's got homunculus, or what they call barber's poleworm, it's not very well, so it's already lost performance. Then if you treat it, the worm is a poison. Like Ed was saying, don't tip it in water or whatever, things like that. So you're putting a poison in that thing. Okay, you've got to use it for the welfare of that animal, but if you can avoid getting there in the first place, the lamb's not in an unhealthy position, and you haven't had to use the wormer, and then you get all these knock-on effects of the wormers then not in the dung, as in the soil, affects your dung beetles. We've got masses of dung beetles. They're just not, an issue. And the other thing is looking at I think Matt's slide earlier, or Ed's, the whole what's happening in the soil, I think, is far more complex than any of us really understand, and it all ties into triazoles, good rotations, wormers, the whole lot. And we don't really know how they're working together. So when you end up in a good sort of proper rotation of using things together, your yields are better, because I think your crops are mining phosphate, potash, water. If you go back to Going the wrong way. I think we got... that's a crop of spring barley taken this week. That's had under 3 inches of rain. It's up here. It's about to lodge. It's had a plant growth regulator. Over chalk, so not heavy wet ground, but in a dry summer on dry soil. That's 8, 9, 10 tonne a hectare. And you just get the feeling it's just mining everything so much more efficiently. If you dig the soil up, it's just crumbly. It feels different. Someone here earlier was talking about roots and how they look different in a sort of regenerative or proper mixed farming system. And it's healthy plants, it's healthy animals without really using a lot of the modern interventions. But if you need them, they're there, and you've got this sort of confidence they're going to work, but it's getting the mindset of sort of working around them and using them when you need them, sort of thing. Not sure what other slides we've got here. Yeah, and there's some wheat taken last week. That wheat crop could be more likely over 14 tonne a hectare than under in a dry summer. That came out of a 3-year lay, out winter cattle, sheep on it, just sort of proper old-fashioned farming. And the herbicide input is massively reduced. You've got healthier plants, so you're getting a better response out of your fungicides or using less fungicides, things like that. So what we're sort of trying to do is put the science into what's almost avoiding needing the science. And your animals over there would do it. Your crops will do it for the animals. But if you need these interventions, you've got the confidence they will work, but it's sort of getting the mindset. You can sort of almost 90% of the time avoid using them. So it's not organic, but it's sort of it's 90% of that, and it's a lot of what you're going to learn about here today at Groundswell. So yeah, okay, that's a sort of brief summary of what we're trying to do.
So David has kind of undersold himself a little bit there. He's actually a very famous farmer in his Oxfordshire area and has massive crops every year, very high quality, no issues with weed, pest or disease on the farm. He just doesn't have any issues, and it's because of the way he farms. Really hygienic and just, really a really good example of how you should do mixed farming. So thanks, David, for being here today. I know it was your first time at Groundswell. Okay, so that's been our kind of presentation session here now. So we've got about 20 minutes really to take any questions. So we've got a roving mic if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question and to our speakers today. Great, wonderful. We'll wait for the roving mic to come over there.
Hi, sorry, I'm Tom Appleby. I'm a lawyer, I'm afraid, from University of the West of England. The question I've got on this is, with pubs, if they serve people who are drunk and they carry on doing it, they're responsible for the impacts of someone of drunken behaviour. At what point, we need fungicides for medicine, if nothing else. At what point, so I'm not bashing the pharmaceutical industry, but at what point are the pharmaceutical industry responsible for over-pushing and overselling these things when they have damaging repercussions in the public sector down the line?
So I'm happy to answer the crop side, but I think, Matt, if anyone wants to take the animals or the human side, that would be really good. And then I'll take the crops afterwards. So does anyone...
It's an interesting thought experiment. What if there was a class action suit by all of the people with risk factors who are getting azole-resistant aspergillosis and said, okay, this is, you cannot use fungicides anymore. They are killing us through this microbial inocular. At that point, you've been removed. Your crop protection is removed. First of all, can you do your business? And I imagine that the yield loss would be considerable. But then you come in with a solution, which is, okay, well, what about this genetically modified barley that has encoded resistance and so we're getting to the concept of fungicide-free farming here. We don't poison our soils. We don't poison our people. Is it possible? And would you plant that crop?
I was going to use the example, if you go back to the harvest of 2012, which for wheat was absolutely dreadful. It rained about every day from the 1st of March to the end of August. And Fusarium, ear blight, septoria decimated heavily treated crops. And if you, at the time, spoke to some of the elder farmers, they'd have said in the 1930s, that weather would have meant almost zero wheat harvest and zero, even less ability to make bread out of it. Now, you could say we're going to be go completely organic or whatever, you're going to ban all fungicides, you don't need them, you can do it through plant breeding. Whatever plant it was, the breeding in that, wheat varieties were hammered. So it was sort of, you're almost looking at like the potato blight before we had blight fungicides in Ireland. Well, starvation is a knock-on effect. The best recent example, if you go to Sri Lanka, where they decided overnight they were going to go organic, it crashed the economy, starvation, massive imports. It's not very good. There's, that's a wonderful, well, not a wonderful example if you're Sri Lankan and you starve, but it shows what these bring to us. Yes, the regulation is huge. It takes years to bring these products to the market. Quite a lot are being withdrawn for various reasons. There's things are found out. And so, yeah.
I'll take that one in a second, don't worry.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's sort of, I would say, wishful thinking that in reality it's got much bigger consequences. And it's a very regulated market. So, yeah,
Well, I guess there is a sort of soft way into that with animals, in that there have been people who've gone on to antibiotic-free contracts for selling their milk or meat, and they've done that voluntarily, so that they've sort of gone into it with their eyes open, but not necessarily because they wanted to, but perhaps because who they were selling their product to, that was where they saw the market heading, and so very rapidly you've got a complete change of framework and a change of mindset, and although those farms would still have to use some antibiotic for welfare on some very sick animals, those animals would not be able to be sold into that supply chain. So they would then be really limiting the number of animals treated to those that absolutely needed it in order to survive. And whilst it was challenging, it made us think outside the box a little bit. It made those farmers really think about their system and their husbandry, and putting in place absolutely everything that they could to avoid needing those products, knowing that if they absolutely had to, they could fall back on them, but effectively that animal is a write-off financially, and it provided some learnings then that people who are not on such stringent contracts, you could say, well, look, we've been in this scenario. People who were using a significant amount have gone down to next to nothing without a dramatic loss of yield and so on. So whilst the scenario for, I'm not an arable farmer, and the scenario that David paints sounds horrible. I don't want to starve any more than the next guy. But in an animal husbandry context, it's not such a disaster.
And then from the crop side of things, we do actually have quite a lot of regulation that... the short answer to that is the agrochemical companies are not responsible. The buck does not stop with them. The buck starts with the farmer, the agronomist. The buck stops with CRD. It stops with AFA. Lots of different people. And we, just like Ed said, we have very stringent requirements in the UK for making sure that pesticides are used appropriately, whether that be MRLs for things like strobilurins, for herbicides, whether it be for insecticides for things like sugar beet and aphids. So we use thresholds there for deciding whether we need to make an emergency authorization for cruiser on seed treatments. But if you do not follow those, the buck stops with the farmer or the agronomist or the end user. Now, there are cases where, for example, I've come across where a failed crop of spring barley and full of net blotch, the farmer lost the crop, he had to make an insurance claim. there are people who are specifically trained on this in agronomy, or maybe they've got a lawyer background that do investigate those claims. And in those cases, they will have to go through multiple strands to find out who is responsible. And so that may be where things like the IChem gets involved, the agronomist gets involved, lots of different people have to get involved in that. But there are a lot of specific things in the UK that protect us from resistance arising or inappropriate use of pesticides in the plant and crop world. I'm not really sure about the human world. Maybe it's a bit less stringent. We need a doctor or a GP here to talk about this.
So I'm going to ask you about the human world. Matthew Fisher over here.
Hi, Matthew Fisher.
Yeah, that's my name as well. So I'm a farmer, and I use triazoles to get rid of rust. It's our last resort. We do take sap tests, and we try and balance the nutrients in the plant, and we try and treat the soil microbially to keep healthy plants. Would you say, though, that so we're treating a symptom of our bad work, you could probably say. Chronic diseases in humans, is that because of what we eat? And therefore using triazoles to treat diseases is only treating the symptom?
I mean, so we've always, our immune systems have been honed to deal with fungi over evolutionary time. Aspergillus fumigatus causes half the global burden of disease. It's just the mold that you're all familiar with because it'll rot your orange down in your kitchen or whatever. We've got specific immune cells that mop that up, and we're bulletproof until we get a risk factor, and that could be any one of these ones that I mentioned earlier. You know, if any reason your immune system dips down. So it's not that we're seeing more of these fungal infections. We just have a base level that's associated with those human risk factors. It's just that they are becoming resistant to the very few drugs that the doctors have got. And it's because we're forced to use the same class of chemicals in the clinic as in the environment. And so the way out of this dilemma is to actually to just develop a new antifungal drug for use in humans and to not use it in the environment, or use it in a very risk-based manner. That would be the smartest thing to do. And luckily, you know, pharma has come up with some really new, wonderful new human drugs, alorifin being one. It's taken 20 years and, you know, almost £1 billion to produce, but that works fantastically against these mold infections. So perhaps that's the solution here, is we have some drugs for use in humans to deal with those unlucky cases, and others that are just used for farms to deal with the sorts of you know, blights that as they come along.
So if the person that's got the disease is eating organic food all their lives, are they still resistant to the triazole?
We're all exposed to this because the mold spores are in the air. I mean, that's just, the air is full of fungal spores, and you know, so but our immune system expects to see that. Some of them are now, quite a lot of them are now resistant, but they'll be cleared up by the human immune system. It's just if you're sick, then they'll establish. It's not whether you've eaten organic food or conventional food, it's just that you got unlucky. And life delivers curveballs for us all. And it's the doctor's job to cure those individuals. It's a terrible thing when their drugs don't work anymore. And that's kind of what we're trying to get our heads around here.
But I think your point, Matthew, about longer term effects and therefore susceptibility to disease is an important one. You know, to an extent, you are what you eat, whether you're a plant or an animal or a person. And we are seeing in our human population a burden of chronic disease, aren't we? Whether that's you know, diabetes, cancer, whatever. It's multifactorial why that's the case, but the way that our society and our healthcare system is set up at the moment is all about treating symptoms rather than addressing causes, and that's a problem for us to tackle as society as a whole. I saw there was another talk on here today called Ozempic versus organic. Yes. You know, how do you approach obesity? Is it through changing how we eat, or is it through injecting ourselves with stuff to make us less hungry? And that's the challenge that faces us. And I guess one of the, this talk is about One Health and how human health sits within that wider context. And we need to ask ourselves as a society how we want to eat, how we want the animals under our care to eat, and what impact does that have on the environment around us.
Hi, my name's Anne Howard. I was a GP for 30 years. I am very worried about the medics dishing out antimicrobials and antifungals and all the other things. Were there specific things that you felt that we could change? Or I can't remember who talked about it most, but was there something specific that you felt that this needs action, and we should make this knowledge more widespread?
Maybe we could all answer that individually from our own specific areas of interest. So for me, particularly around the crops, is hygiene. Before I started working in arable crops, I spent a lot of time in horticulture and in tomato nurseries, greenhouses, and hygiene there is on another level. I mean, every single thing that goes into that greenhouse is sterilised before it goes in, and as soon as it comes back out, it is taken off and never makes its way back into the greenhouse again. So hygiene in your arable systems. We're talking specifically about plants now, but that is the ultimate prevention there from stopping anything entering into your farm in the first place. Would be all I would add to that.
I mean, I think it all comes down to drug stewardship and sensible use of drugs. Doctors are very good at knowing when to give antifungals. They don't give them willy-nilly because they make you feel really rotten. Antibiotics are a different matter, and there's a huge push to reduce the amount of antibiotics that people are given. So you don't want to give an antibiotic to someone who's got a viral respiratory infection. And that's all about educating the clinicians, and they're getting better at that. And the government has some nice, a big push in this area to dial down the use of antibiotics in the GP surgeries, for instance.
There was some very low-hanging fruit in livestock agriculture in terms of reducing the amount of antibiotics used. There was a reasonable amount of prophylactic antibiotic used, which was something that you could immediately address. And then there was also the way in which antibiotics were used as, just another thing that you would buy off the shelf to address a problem. And Red Tractor were very helpful actually in putting in place some of the frameworks to address that. So if you're farm assured now, part of your farm assurance is to have an annual antibiotic audit. So the vet is in a slightly awkward position as a sort of poacher and gamekeeper in a way, because we are prescribing and selling the antibiotics at the same time as encouraging a reduction in their use. And that can be confusing for everybody, perhaps. But I would hope that most vets in coming into practice now are very much aware of the veterinary role in antimicrobial resistance and are therefore conscious of the approaches that we can use in terms of hygiene, as you've referred to, but also a diet, breeding, genetics, welfare, husbandry, reducing those stress factors that I talked about, all of those things. And so when we do that antibiotic audit, you can see, here's what you've used in the last year. Let's delve into what exactly you've used it for, and then let's see what factors in your system are leading to a higher incidence of those things. And I think if GP practices or healthcare areas were doing the same way, chances are, 3/4 of the antibiotics prescribed would be for a specific number of conditions in certain situations, whether that's people who are already suffering from chronic disease or secondary to chemotherapy, or any number of different things which could be identified in an antibiotic audit, and then year on year build on the good practice that you've started to establish, so that you have a continued reduction down to that as little as necessary.
So, David, I think you should answer as well for once, seeing as like you're implementing all this on your farm through the crops and the livestock.
Aoife covered hygiene, and it's sort of, I think, on an on-farm basis, that covers so many bases. It can be from buying in disease in animals, be very careful where you're buying from. Some things you can control the controllables, which is black grass, so not get black grass seed on your farm. It can come from anywhere, from buying in seed, from a baler, from a combine. Animal diseases, be very careful, work with your vet. We've been very proactive getting our vet to work with their clients on where they're buying stock and things like that. So yeah, a lot of hygiene you can control, but then like Matt says, there's funguses growing around here, there's yellow rust growing around here, there's some things you cannot control on your farm, but control the controllables, and you're quite a long way there. And it's like I said earlier, if you're using everything less, you've got much more confidence it's going to work when you use it, and you feel like you're using it because you have to, so you're getting the benefit out of it. And it's the same, of our own health. Sort of, I always think if you get a bit of an annoying cold or bug or something like that, if you see it through, it's sort of, you feel like you're doing it yourself and use these interventions as a last resort, and then you've got that sort of mindset that they will work. So yeah.
Hello, is it working? Yeah. Hello, this is addressed to Ed really because we have met before, and I want to say a huge thank you to you for bringing up the not just antimicrobial resistance, but also the fact that when people are using parasitics and those sort of things, that is going into the land, because the people here are the ones that really need to hear that. And while Vet Sustain knows that, because you lot love your dung beetles, a lot of other vets don't. So it would be nice if that became better knowledge in the vet world, really. So a huge thank you for bringing that up, broadening the spectrum of what we're thinking about and talking about. And then you talk about the low-hanging fruit. A lot of farmers have already dealt, as you say, with what were the easy bits of reducing the drugs on their farm, and they're being monitored. What is the next stage? Because I'm helping a farmer with preventative measures on his dairy farm, and using alternative measures, I have now brought his antibiotic use down again. He's already done the low-hanging fruit that you're talking about. Now he's going the next step. And we've now done a really marvellous thing with keeping the flies out of the parlour, for example, so that the farmer himself sees that what we're doing really works. And that means that he hasn't bothered, as part of what would have been his routine, that now's the time to do your fly spray. He hasn't bothered to do it, which saves him money, but it also saves the environment and the river that's just down the road. So that's my question really, is what's the next part? Where are we going to go next with this?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. You're right, dealing with the low-hanging fruit is the easy first part. I think that events like this are a good example of how farmers really like to come together and learn from each other. One of the problems for farmers is there's an array of experts constantly telling them sometimes conflicting information, I think. And one of the exciting things about some of the sort of behavior change work that's taken place in farming is seeing some of the effects that can be gained from discussion groups, for example. So where farmers can come together and share experiences, talk about what has worked in practice and what hasn't, and also share some of their data. As I said, within any group, if you benchmark whether it's antibiotic use or wormer use or any other data point that you care to look at, there will be a range within the group, and there will be things that the group can learn from the lowest users in each scenario. And generally, the things that we learn would be adjustments to husbandry rather than uses of different products or maybe just giving people the confidence not to use a product and see what happens.
So we've got time for 2 more questions, I think, but our speakers will be around afterwards as well. So 2 more questions, and I think we'll wrap it up then.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sophie Robbins from Forum for the Future, a sustainability charity, and we run a coalition looking at the intersection of climate and health. So this is super fascinating. I just wondered, kind of tagging on to these questions, the understanding in the broader value chain about this challenge, particularly around antimicrobial and antifungal side of it, and whether there's a role for the broader supply chain in supporting these shifts, or whether, like you said, the voluntary action of farmers versus something that they do in collaboration more broadly.
I can take a little bit from the crop side again. So there is some. They're mostly commercial based. So the supermarkets, for example, get involved. Some of the big kind of companies, food producing companies, get involved, where they look at pesticide free futures, various things, but not looking at it from healthy plants, healthy people, healthy livestock. They're not looking at it from that regard. It is very much segmented at the moment, but there is definitely initiatives out there to look at reducing pesticides on farms and livestock. It's not completely joined up on the health side as well, but there's quite a few there. I don't know about any other initiatives on a commercial scale. Maybe Ed can tag on to that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think people often look to government for policy direction, but that, as we know, that can change very quickly and quite dramatically. So I think that farmers often feel more comfortable where they're being able to make their own decisions, not necessarily influenced by the shifting winds of policy. So whatever we're doing on farm, it has to be profitable in order to be sustainable. It has to sit right with how you want to farm. But there are organizations like Pasture for Life, for example, or Red Tractor, where enough farmers are voluntarily signed up to those industry-led initiatives that change at scale can happen. And I suppose that where government can come in a little bit to support that is through procurement. So, this is all leading in to the food system. The food system is a massive driver of change. At the moment, the food system is led by price. And because such a huge proportion of the food that's eaten in our society is in a public setting, whether that be schools, hospitals, councils, government offices, and so on, that then the billions of pounds that government spends on food can be quite a big driver for change in the food system. And if there's confidence in a market for healthy food produced to particular sets of standards, that enables farmers then to really back themselves to produce according to those standards. So I think that there's not a single answer, but all of those different sectors have to come together a bit to find what works for them.
Hello. My name's Matthew Wilson. I run a farm in Norway. The problem that we have is it's specifically around homuncus and treatment of homuncus. We have permanent pasture and very little room for rotation. What kind of strategies can we use in a system like that where we have pasture which is used year on year?
Yeah, that is difficult. I think that David has very well illustrated the value of rotation. Part of the reason that his system works is that stock are going into worm-free grazing, crops are going into pathogen-free ground, and so we can see a system that's full of vitality where everything has the opportunity to thrive. I guess in a permanent pasture situation, it is much more difficult, but there are a few things that we can do in that we can categorize our pasture a little bit according to the risk level. So wherever you have seen Haemonchus in the previous season or that season, it's going to be high risk, and there will be areas where perhaps you haven't seen Haemonchus on the farm that will be lower risk. And then we also can then categorize our stock according to high risk and low risk. Now, I know with Haemonchus, you don't develop immunity in much the same way as we do to other gutworms, but cattle, for example, would be less susceptible, and so you would choose to graze your high risk pasture with your low risk stock, and you would also choose to improve your plant diversity in your permanent pasture, perhaps to favour some plant species which will grow a bit taller without losing quality. And then we can look at extending our rotation length. The longer the rotation, the more scope there is for parasites to desiccate on the pasture. So any stock revisiting that same bit of ground that's already been grazed, that ground has had a really long rest. The risk level of that pasture is going to be lower because the parasites will have desiccated to an extent. And also, if we're grazing taller sward heights, we don't need to graze down so low. And a lot of the worm burden would be in the lower part of the sward. So we can change our grazing practices to fit our parasite risk level a little bit. And if you have a look on the Dung Beetles for Farmers website, then there's quite a lot of good resources on there that Claire Whittle and Sally Ann Spence have spent time putting together, and it would be a good place to start.
Is there no biocontrol for Haemonchus, such as nematode trapping fungi?
Very possibly. You might have spotted a gap in the market.
Ha!
I think there's one or two farmers who are trying to use their reduce their worming by subjecting where they have problems is leaving it longer untouched as a burden within the sheep, and then selecting breeding from the lambs that are surviving better to somehow sort of, I think Ed would know this, sort of, if you take your breeding stock from the less, the 10% of higher performing lambs and a high worm burden, they've obviously got some natural genetic ability to tolerate worms more or get over them. So you're sort of I don't know, it's completely the answer, but it's a bit like in plant breeding. If you can get half your yellow rust control from the plant breeding, then your triazol's got a lot less work to do, and some years you won't have to use it. So I don't know if it's actually for the Haemonchus barber's poleworm, but whether it's more the roundworms, but there is some work on that of allowing them to develop infection and then breed from the I wouldn't say survivors, because obviously in the end you're going to treat everything, but sort of working out the better performers in that situation.
Yeah, as you say, David, there's more work on other gutworms in that, but it's definitely possible. And with Haemonchus in particular, there's a scoring system called FAMATCHA, in which you basically grade the severity of infestation on the colour of the mucous membrane around the eye. Because Haemonchus causes anemia, then the paler the animal, the greater the need for treatment. So you can reduce the proportion of the animals treated in any affected group by only treating the ones that are exhibiting signs of anemia. And with good records, as David says, you can make sure that you only retain replacements from animals which have been treated the smallest number of times, so that we breed a more resilient animal that is able to thrive in that environment. And Haemonchus, I guess Norway is probably the northernmost limit for Haemonchus. Historically, it's been a disease of the tropics, and so we can look to farmers in Africa, for example, who've been living with Haemonchus for millennia, as to the breeding and husbandry strategies that they've adopted in order to cope with it, because we're going to have to do the same as things warm up.
Okay, so we're approaching 5 o'clock now. We could take one more question if there was one. I saw a hand up. If not, any last comments from the speakers before we tie up? So yeah, thank you so much to Matt from Imperial, Ed from Vet Sustain, and David Passmore from Oxfordshire.